Today I'm continuing my series on Dr. Gary Habermas's unfortunate misunderstandings of liberal scholars. I'll be focusing mostly in this series on the Jesus Seminar. Later I'll probably have one video on his inaccurate citing of Dale Allison's current views. But mostly I'll focus on the Jesus Seminar. Now, last time, as you remember, I was demonstrating very clearly that Dr. Habermas is jumping to conclusions concerning some lists given in a book about the findings of the Jesus Seminar, a book by the Jesus Seminar, Funk and others. It's called The Acts of Jesus. And on a couple of pages, there are lists of resurrection appearance accounts or sources. Dr. Habermas insists that these are independent. And I read where he says that, and he makes a big deal about it. He keeps saying they list these independent sources, and so even the Jesus Seminar acknowledges that these appearances, and these were appearances to groups, are multiply attested. And it's just a radical misunderstanding, because it turns out that those lists on those 2 pages, and I encourage you to go look them up. You can check the book out for free for reading on Open Library. They're just listing all the sources. And then their discussion is going to tell you how dependent or independent or intertwined they think those are. So he just leaps to that conclusion and then doesn't seem to have seen explicit statements that they make about sources that are listed as different line items in those lists being dependent on one another, which makes it very clear that the inclusion of them on separate lines in those lists does not mean that the Jesus Seminar is treating them as independent sources. This is a really big deal. It's a really big misunderstanding. One example I gave is that Habermas thinks that they're listing both the longer ending of Mark and Luke 24 as independent reports of the appearance to 2 on the road to Emmaus. And then they explicitly say that the pseudo-Mark, as they call the long ending of Mark, is dependent on earlier accounts. So, it's like as explicit as it possibly can be. In those same lists on those same pages, they have a bunch of different sources listed for the empty tomb. But then they explicitly say that Matthew's and Luke's accounts of the empty tomb are based on Mark's, even though Mark, Matthew, and Luke are listed separately in those lists. Now, I'm not saying Habermas cites specifically the empty tomb as being a place where they acknowledge independent sources. He's especially emphasizing it concerning group appearances, but it's the same pages, the same page in the same set of lists, okay, that he's citing as showing that the Jesus Seminar acknowledges the group appearances to be independently attested. So their treatment of those different items concerning the empty tomb is further evidence about what they're really saying and what they're not saying, okay? And it just looks like he didn't read the following pages or didn't understand them, where they're very explicit that these are not independent sources that they're listing. They're just all the sources. All right. Now, I want to go at this a slightly different way, this question of whether the Jesus Seminar admits that the group appearances are independently attested. They don't. They absolutely don't. One way for 2 or more sources to be dependent on one another would be if source B is based on source A, okay? And source A is not reality, okay? When I say a source, I mean here, some account that might be very good as far as its connection with reality or might not be, but it's an account. All right. So we see that with Emmaus Road and what they say about the appearance there. But there's another way for two or more sources to be dependent and not to be independent. And that is if you have a source, again, not reality, something that is more or less connected with reality, whatever it might be. It might be completely fictional, it might be completely factual, but it's an account of something. And then you've got two or more sources that are springing from that, and that's their only connection with reality. And then beyond that, they're making their own changes, maybe adding non-factual elements or whatever it might be. But in that case, you only have one source about what happened, which is the sort of the node from which the other accounts spring. And the Jesus Seminar is very clear that this is what they believe is happening in the case of the accounts of the appearances to the 11 in the Gospels. In other videos when I've talked about this, independence and multiple attestation, I've placed the common source above and then spoken of the other sources as being sort of downstream from it. So it's like that's a common source that has some informational connection to reality or not, as case may be. And then you have streams of information coming from that to, say, two other places, which might be, just embellished, but those other two sources don't have any other, place where they sort of jump backward and directly are connected to reality. Okay, and this comes up in the discussion of the infancy narratives in an online debate that Dr. Lacona did some years ago with Bart Ehrman, where he said that maybe there was a tradition about Jesus' birth that included certain propositions, like he was born of a virgin, he was born in Bethlehem, and that maybe, he just kept saying maybe, I don't know if this is what happened, but, maybe, Luke and Matthew elaborated or embellished that common tradition that they had. And then he says, but in that case, the overlapping facts would be multiply attested and therefore secure. And that's not true, because the overlapping facts would merely come from this common node, this common tradition. So then that's our only actual source in that hypothesis. The way I put this is independent imagination is not independent attestation. I'm going to say that again. Independent imagination is not independent attestation. So if that's really what Matthew and Luke did, no, the overlapping facts or propositions claiming to be facts, like that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, are not multiply attested. In that scenario, they're singly attested, namely by this tradition, just the fact that these people, the Christians believed those things at the time when Matthew and Luke decided to take off on their own and elaborate that common tradition. So today I'm going to actually use a slightly different visual model, and I may go find a, free image somewhere of a tree. So I'm gonna imagine the common source as being like a trunk of the tree, okay, and then you've got branches coming from it. Now, where the metaphor breaks down a little bit is that we're not saying anything about how well rooted the trunk of that tree is in reality, because the trunk of the tree is like a tradition or an account, which might or might not be true. It might even be wholly invented in itself, okay? So it might have like no connection to the ground if we see the ground as reality. But for visual purposes, imagine one of these common source cases of no independence, where you just have that common source as the trunk, and then the branches are places where all that people are relying on, their only source to the ground of reality is that common trunk. And then if they're making further claims that are not found in that common trunk, or if they're changing things, they're just doing that out of their own heads. Now, the Jesus Seminar makes it absolutely clear that when it comes to group appearances, specifically the appearance to the 11 or the 12, this is how they view it, that a common source of some kind has been elaborated by later authors. So in that case as well, it's not multiply attested, if they were right about that, that Jesus appeared to his core disciples, a group known as the 12 or known as the 11, even though there weren't technically 11, much less 12 members present on those occasions. All right, so I want to document this, that the Jesus Seminar is saying that that appearance to that group is not independent, because there are later accounts that are just based on some kind of common stub or trunk. All right, page 453. I'm quoting again from this book by the Jesus Seminar. I'll link it again in the show notes. Many scholars have concluded that the earliest appearances were located in Galilee, as forecast in the Gospel of Mark and supported by Matthew, who is dependent on Mark. Okay, now I'm going to read a couple more things about the relationship they see between Matthew's story of Jesus appearing to the 11 and the Gospel of Mark. Page 451. The Gospel of Matthew borrows and revises Mark's empty tomb story and adds concise stories of an appearance to 2 women and an appearance to the 11 on a mountain in Galilee. Matthew's sources beyond Mark may be no more than his fertile imagination. It's pretty clear. Page 484. This concerns the appearance to the 11 in Matthew 28. Matthew's account is composed in Matthean style and with words in Matthew's standard vocabulary. It is therefore a Matthean composition based on the promise made in Mark 16:7, but go tell his disciples, including Rock, that's how they're translating Cephas, he is going ahead of you to Galilee, there you will see him just as he told you. So let's get this clear. They're saying that Matthew's appearance story of an appearance to the 11 is just his free composition based solely on the trunk of Mark's statement about what the angel said, which is in Mark 16:7, that the angel, and they think Mark, that's all fictional too. But the point is that Mark is the sort of basis for Matthew's story of the appearance to the 11. So in Mark, we have a trunk, a promise to appear to the 11 in Galilee, and in Matthew, we have the story of Jesus' appearance to the 11 in Galilee. Notice too that, and this will be relevant next time, that they use the term concise, which has to do with brevity and literary form. It does not indicate factuality. We'll talk, or need not, depends on the critic. We'll talk about that next time. Definitely doesn't indicate factuality in the Jesus Seminar. But anyway, Matthew's just elaborating based on that promise in Mark. He has no other connection to reality. All right. Concerning Luke's account of an appearance to the 11, page 451, back in 451, appearance stories in the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts likewise begin with Mark. Luke once again revises Mark's story of the empty tomb, reports an appearance to Peter, and relates an intermediate account of the final appearance to the 11. He adds the legends of the appearance to the 2 on the road to Emmaus and the Ascension. Luke may have known of some stray oral traditions, tales that had not yet been captured in writing, that he made use of in elaborating his stories, or he may only have drawn on his own imagination. Now notice, by the way, this again will be important next time, that the fact that something isn't called legend, the fact that it's called something else like an intermediate account, doesn't mean that it's partially factual. In the Jesus Seminar terminology, legend is a technical term referring to the degree of literary wonderfulness, polish, tale-telling, style in the story, not to its being less factual than an intermediate account. They can both be completely made up. So that's going to be important. This is form criticism. And again, but the point for this video is that Luke's appearance to the story of the appearance to the 11, they say, is starting with Mark, that it begins with Mark and he revises Mark's account. Now, it's pretty common to take it that Luke revises Mark's empty tomb story by moving the appearance to Jerusalem. Even Dr. Mike Licona thinks that, and said it during a debate with Bart Ehrman, or at least he thought it then when he had the debate with Bart Ehrman. But the point here is that it is not regarded as an independent attestation of the appearance to the 11, because it's just based on revising Mark. So again, we have this trunk branch relationship. But here's more. All right, the trunk has different aspects to it as well. Mark's account and the Mark saying that the angel promised that Jesus would appear to the 11, but also the appearance to Peter. Now, the Jesus Seminar actually thinks, as far as I recall, that Peter had some kind of experience, but of course Peter's only one guy, so they don't, regard that as having been veridical, and it wouldn't be a group experience, and so it would be easier to explain away as non-veridical. Here's what they have to say very explicitly about the 11 as a group. Pages 484 to 485. The fellows of the Jesus Seminar were doubtful that the 11 as a group ever experienced a vision of the risen Jesus at one time. The general statement received a gray vote. The tradition probably arose as a confirmation of apostolic authority connected to the experience of some of those who had been closely associated with Jesus during his life. An appearance to Peter may well have been generalized as an appearance to the 11 in order to include the whole symbolic circle of associates, end quote. So if this conjecture, which they say is probable, okay, may well have, okay, if this theory is true, then none of the stories of the appearances to the 11 are independent of each other, because they all arose as various fictional developments from the claim of an appearance to Peter, to try to include the whole symbolic circle of associates, so that they're like, oh gee, basically we really only know of him appearing to Peter, but we want to give the rest of the 11 authority, think the developers, so we'll make up stories in which he appears to the 11 as a group. A gray vote from the Jesus Seminar is possible but unreliable. So they really doubt any group appearance, and for purposes of independence, they're giving a theory. So you could have a trunk of Peter having some kind of, in their view, hallucination or whatever, but Peter having some kind of resurrection appearance experience, okay? And then you also, in there, somewhere in the trunk, you have Mark making up something about promising to appear, Mark, or his source, making up something about the angel promising that Jesus is going to appear in Galilee, and under the influence of those two things, all the other appearance stories to the 11 are developments, which would be Matthew and Luke and John, because they all have a report of some sort of appearance to the 11. Some in Galilee and one in Jerusalem. All right, so then none of them are independent. All of the gospel accounts of an actual appearance to the 11, where they narrate it, would all be sprung from this root well, I won't say root. No, I'm not using root. Trunk. Sprung from this trunk of an appearance to Peter. And then a motive, a common motive of wanting to make it look like the rest of the apostles also have authority. So again, possible but unreliable that there even was a group appearance. Now, Habermas is not saying that the Jesus Seminar grants that a group appearance to the 11 occurred. He's saying something a little different than that. He's saying that they grant that it is multiply attested that this group experience occurred, or that some such group experience occurred. All right, but they don't even grant that. And I think, what he would probably say is, well, if they grant that it's multiply attested, then for them to not grant that it happened is just very arbitrary. I mean, even that, not necessarily, because some critical scholars require 2 or more criteria of authenticity to be met, and multiple attestation would only be 1. But waive that. I think his idea is, well, they ought to give it some credence, because they grant that it's multiply attested, but they don't. Okay? As we saw before, those lists don't mean, that list on page 450, I think it is, and the other one on page 452 are not lists of independent sources. They're just lists of any sources. And moreover, they even have a story to tell about how the stories of the group appearances grew from a common source. Okay? Now, I think that they're wrong. I think that's completely wrong, completely crazy. But I'm not trying to do a minimal facts approach. And I'm not trying to go out there and, grab whatever I can find and say, oh, look, even the Jesus Seminar acknowledges this. I know the Jesus Seminar doesn't, acknowledge something exciting or interesting. So does a large majority of scholars across the scholarly spectrum acknowledge that there was a group resurrection appearance experience of some kind? Well, as I've always said in my other criticisms of the minimal facts approach, given the looseness of the concept of a experience or a group experience, I mean, it's being deliberately fuzzified to include as many people as possible, including skeptics, sure, it's possible that a majority does acknowledge that there was some sort of group experience of some kind. That could be a ghostly type experience, or it could be a sense of presence, or some kind of ecstatic situation where each person is seeing something a little different in his mind, which he thinks of as seeing Jesus. It could be a lot of things, okay? But the problem is that Habermas thinks that the Jesus Seminar specifically acknowledges something very exciting about the group experience, namely that it is multiply attested. Okay? And it's like, wow, because now we're using critical scholarly types of standards like multiple attestation. Even critical scholars respect that, and the Jesus Seminar ought to respect that, even if they don't, because look at this big admission by them that it's multiply attested, and they don't even acknowledge that. Now, next time we're going to see that Habermas thinks that the Jesus Seminar specifically shows respect for the story of the first appearances to the male disciples in the book of John. And he uses the word respect. And then he even implies that they show some lesser degree of respect, some respect or other, though of a lesser degree, to the second appearance in John, which is the doubting Thomas story. That's a really bad misunderstanding as well. So in multiple ways, Dr. Habermas is trying to claim some kind of exciting, he uses words like, amazing and astonishing and so forth, concessions made by the Jesus Seminar concerning group appearances, and it won't fly. It won't hold water. The Jesus Seminar doesn't make any astonishing or interesting concessions about group appearances in the Gospels. If we're going to make a case, that doesn't mean we have to beg the question or something, but we're going to have to be willing to go up against these highly critical scholars rather than trying to basically claim that they acknowledge so many premises and premises and premises, which, if they were just consistent and followed their own criteria, should lead them to conclude that Jesus rose again, and so the only possible explanation is a anti-supernatural bias, etc. That's how the presentation goes with regard to the minimal facts approach. The reality is a lot more complex, and what has been baked into New Testament scholarship, even for those who do not have an anti-supernatural bias, is a set of poor historical standards. And we have to be willing to challenge those inaccurate historical standards, inaccurate from a neutral point of view, not just because I'm a Christian, okay? And that involves getting our hands dirty in a much more nitty-gritty kind of way. Again, this is not arising from some kind of personal animus against Dr. Habermas, but this multi-volume work that's coming out right now is just being touted as like, now, it's big, it's heavy, look at all these pages. Now we've got this incredibly strong argument for the resurrection, and he's giving us, the receipts, as it were. And unfortunately, the more you look into the receipts, the more you see that the books don't balance, if I can put it that way. And you look at it and you go, wait, what? You're saying the Jesus Seminar acknowledges that it's calling these independent sources? No, they're so clear that they absolutely don't. And so it's a very, very serious problem with that minimal facts approach, which relies so heavily on Dr. Habermas's claims about what scholars acknowledge and his literature survey. Okay, come back next time and we'll be talking about the question, does the Jesus Seminar respect, even to some degree, the first appearance account in John and or the Doubting Thomas story? Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. We just passed 5,000 subscribers, so that's really exciting. It's something that has just sort of happened all on its own. I hadn't even made a big push, but I'm really grateful for all of you who have subscribed to the Lydia McGrew channel.